At 6 a.m. I was supposed to be in the kitchen, pots boiling, ovens heated, my hands already deep in flour and seasonings, preparing breakfast and lunch for 20 hungry relatives who were scheduled to arrive. My daughter-in-law had handed me the guest list the night before, her voice sharp, her eyes daring me to complain. My son only added to it, telling me to make sure everything was perfect this time. Perfect, like my entire worth depended on whether or not I could perform as their cook, their housekeeper, their quiet shadow. But instead of tying my apron at dawn, I was fastening my seatbelt. At 4 a.m. while they slept under the same roof, I had slipped out the front door with a single suitcase. By the time the sun began to rise, I was already at the airport, waiting for my boarding call. And by the time their guests arrived, I was thousands of feet in the air, flying away from the house that no longer felt like mine. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Don't just watch silently. Your support keeps these stories alive. For years I carried myself with patience. I was the dependable mother, the loyal grandmother, the one everyone knew would bend instead of break. I was told to wake earlier, work harder, smile wider, and say less. I told myself it was for family, for peace, for love. But every demand took another piece of me, and I began to wonder, when did I stop being their mother and start being their servant? This story is about the moment I decided to stop bowing my head. It's about the morning they expected me to be in the kitchen, but instead they found only silence and empty countertops. It's about the 20 guests who arrived to an empty house and a humiliated host. But more than that, it's about me finally remembering who I was. This time I wasn't going to bend. This time, I had my own plans. I wasn't always this woman who could quietly walk away. For most of my life, my identity was built on giving. I gave time, energy, and years of my youth to one purpose, my son. I carried him when I was young and scared, raised him when I barely had enough for myself, and sacrificed opportunities that could have been mine. Because I believed the measure of a good mother was how much she was willing to endure. I worked double shifts when he was in school. I skipped meals so he could eat. I wore the same pair of shoes for 3 years while he grew out of his faster than I could keep up. I told myself that one day when he was grown, when he found his place in the world, he would look back and remember not just the struggles, but the way I carried him through them. My hope was simple, that he would see me as the woman who gave him everything and treat me with the dignity I thought I had earned. When he graduated, I was the loudest voice in the crowd. When he landed his first job, I was the one who ironed his shirt and polished his shoes. And when he met the woman who would become his wife, I was hopeful. I wanted her to be family, another daughter I could love. At first, she seemed kind enough, polite greetings, soft smiles, and eagerness to be accepted. I welcomed her in with open arms, cooking meals she liked, making room in my heart for her. But warmth has a way of cooling quickly. It started with small things, almost too subtle to notice if I hadn't been paying attention. She began to rearrange the kitchen, moving pots I'd used for years, replacing ingredients I trusted with brands she preferred. I brushed it off. Young wives like to put their mark on a home, I told myself. Then came the comments, slipped in with a laugh but weighted with meaning. You use too much salt, she would say in front of guests. Or, maybe I should cook next time just so things are done right. Her words stung, but I stayed silent. I convinced myself she was nervous, trying too hard. But soon those subtle remarks grew sharper. I noticed how she would lower her voice when she spoke to me, but lift it when she spoke to others. How she would invite me into the kitchen, not to share in cooking, but to hand me the menial tasks, chopping onions, cleaning spills, washing dishes while she plated the meals. I told myself I could endure it. For the sake of my son, for the peace of the house, I could swallow my pride. After all, hadn't I endured worse for him already? But then came the exclusions. Family gatherings where she would hand out invitations but forget mine. Decisions about holidays made without my input. Conversations where my name was left out as though I wasn't part of the family at all. The shift was quiet, but it was clear. I had gone from being the center of my son's world to being the extra pair of hands in the background. I told myself respect would come back in time, that patience would prove my worth. But patience is a dangerous thing. It can make you invisible. The moment that broke something inside me came one evening when I walked past the living room. I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, low but sharp, speaking to her friend over the phone. She laughed as she said, "His mother is useful. At least she cooks and cleans. She knows her place." I froze. Every word felt like a blade. Useful. Knows her place. As though I were a piece of furniture. A tool she could control at will. My hands trembled, my chest tightened, and in that instant, something shifted. The air in the house felt colder, heavier. I realized that to her, I was not family. I was staff. I stepped back before she could see me, the sting of her laughter chasing me down the hallway. My heart ached not just because of her words, but because my son, my own flesh and blood, had allowed this version of me to exist under his roof. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I asked myself a question I had never dared to voice before. Had I raised a man who valued me only for what I could do, and not for who I was? That was the night the seed of rebellion was planted. I didn't know how or when, but I knew this. Something had to change. Because if I stayed silent any longer, I would become exactly what she said I was. A woman who knew her place. And that was a place I could no longer accept. Life after my son's marriage felt like watching my own shadow fade. At first, I tried to convince myself it was adjustment, that every household changes when two people join together, and that I simply needed to find my place in this new rhythm. But slowly, day after day, I realized my place was shrinking, narrowing until it barely existed at all. The house that once echoed with my decisions, what meals would be cooked, what holidays would look like, how traditions would be honored, was no longer mine. My daughter-in-law made choices quickly and loudly, while I stood in the corners nodding as though my silence were consent. Paint colors were changed without my opinion. Furniture was moved, and my treasured heirlooms were pushed into boxes and stored away as if they were clutter. I didn't protest. I told myself I didn't want to cause waves. But deep down, each decision stripped a little more of my authority. Then came the grandchildren. At first, I thought they might bring me back into the fold, that I could be the grandmother who told stories, baked cookies, and reminded them of where their family came from. But even there I was cut short. When I told them bedtime tales from my own childhood, my daughter-in-law would interrupt, saying, "That's too old-fashioned. Let them hear something modern." When I offered to make them breakfast, she would gently but firmly redirect them, saying, "Mommy will do it." I watched their eyes drift away from me toward her, their trust placed where she guided it. It wasn't their fault. They were being taught who to listen to. And slowly, they began to see me not as a guide, but as someone who hovered on the edges, useful only when summoned. My son noticed none of it. Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. His loyalty was no longer mine to count on. Whenever I found the courage to raise a concern, he dismissed it with a quick shake of the head. "Mom, don't take it so personally. She just likes things her way." His words were meant to soothe, but they stung. Because in those moments, I realized his loyalty had shifted. He no longer saw me as the foundation he came from, but as the obstacle he had to defend his wife against. The breaking point for me wasn't loud. It wasn't a screaming match or a slammed door. It was a dinner, one that should have been ordinary. We had relatives over, and as everyone gathered around, my daughter-in-law came into the kitchen holding a sheet of paper. She smiled at the guests, then turned to me and placed it in my hands. A list. A detailed set of instructions for the evening. Cook the chicken. Prepare the salads. Refill drinks. Wash dishes. She didn't disguise it, didn't whisper it quietly. She handed it to me like I was staff, and everyone saw. The room spun as I held that paper. The laughter of relatives carrying on as though nothing unusual had happened. My cheeks burned, not from the stove but from humiliation. My son was right there, and he said nothing. He looked at me, then at her, and instead of stepping in, he smiled weakly and went back to his conversation. That moment told me everything. To him, this wasn't wrong. To him, it was normal. I did as she asked. I chopped, stirred, carried trays. I smiled when spoken to, nodded when directed. But inside, something was breaking apart. Each dish I placed on the table was heavy with resentment. Each glass of water I poured felt like proof that I had been reduced from mother to servant. I moved through that evening like a ghost, invisible except when summoned, silent except when needed. Later, when the guests had left and the house was quiet, I sat alone in the kitchen. The list still lay on the counter, grease-stained and smudged from my hands. I stared at it for a long time, replaying the laughter I had heard earlier when I wasn't in the room, wondering if they mocked me too. I thought about the phone call I had overheard before, her mocking voice saying I was useful because I knew my place. Now I understood what that place was. Obedience without question. That night, I felt myself teetering on the edge of disappearance. If I stayed this way, if I allowed one more list, one more order, one more moment of silence, I would no longer exist as the woman I once was. I would be erased, remembered only as the woman who served until she was too tired to stand. And that was when the thought came, sharp, clear, undeniable. If I didn't take a stand now, I would disappear completely. It happened on a Thursday evening. The house was unusually quiet, but there was a tension in the air that I could feel before I even walked into the living room. My daughter-in-law sat at the table, a stack of papers in front of her, her pen moving quickly. My son leaned against the counter, nodding as she spoke. When I entered, they both looked up, and I felt the weight of their stares before a single word was spoken. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She held out a sheet of paper, crisp and covered in neatly written names, and placed it in my hand. I glanced down and saw a list of 20 guests, relatives and friends, each name a reminder of the endless mouths that would expect to be fed. She looked at me with a faint smile, the kind of smile that held no warmth, only expectation. Her voice was calm but sharp when she said, "You'll need to start cooking at 6 in the morning. Everything has to be ready before noon." Before I could respond, my son stepped forward. His tone carried authority, but not kindness. "And make sure everything is perfect this time," he added, as if I had failed them before. His eyes met mine, but there was no trace of the boy I once held. No flicker of gratitude for the years I had carried him on my back. He looked at me as though I were an employee who needed to be reminded of her duties. My hands trembled as I held that list, the names blurring as my vision clouded with unshed tears. I thought of the countless meals I had prepared over the years, birthdays, graduations, Christmas dinners, times when I had stayed up all night baking and shopping, making sure everything was ready so my family could shine. I thought of the times I went without sleep, without rest, just to see the joy on their faces. And yet, here I was being ordered like a hired cook, as though my value depended on how well I could serve a table. Inside me, emotions clashed: humiliation, anger, sorrow. But above all, there was clarity. This wasn't about food. This was about power. My daughter-in-law wanted to show the family that she commanded me, that I bent to her will. And my son, my own flesh and blood, had allowed it. I lifted my head and forced a smile, though my heart was breaking. "Of course," I said softly. My voice did not tremble, though everything inside me quaked. She nodded, satisfied, and turned away, already discussing decorations and seating arrangements. My son gave me a curt nod, as though I had agreed to a contract, and left the room. But what they didn't know was that in that moment, my decision was already made. I would not be standing in that kitchen at dawn, slaving over dishes for people who would never know the price of my sacrifice. I would not play their servant for an audience of relatives. I would take my dignity back in the quietest way possible, by refusing to be there at all. That night, I sat in my room with a list spread across the bed. I studied the names, each one a reminder of the humiliation they intended for me. And as I looked at it, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of control. I folded the paper neatly, placed it in my drawer, and pulled out my phone. My fingers trembled as I searched for flights. My eyes scanned departure times, and when I found one that left just before dawn, I booked it. The confirmation email felt like a lifeline, a promise of freedom. The hours that followed were filled with quiet preparation. I moved through the house silently, careful not to draw attention. While they assumed I was making lists of ingredients, I was rolling clothes into a suitcase. While they thought I was planning menus, I was arranging for a cab to arrive at 4 in the morning. My movements were deliberate, practiced, the way one moves when carrying a secret too heavy to share. Every zipper I pulled closed, every item I packed, was fueled by years of swallowed pride and quiet obedience. I folded not just clothes, but pieces of myself that I had long forgotten: strength, defiance, dignity. And for the first time in years, I felt lighter, as though each shirt and skirt I placed into the suitcase was a brick lifted off my chest. When the night finally settled, I lay in bed pretending to sleep. The house was still, but my heart raced with anticipation. I thought of their faces when they would wake, expecting to find me in the kitchen with pots already steaming. I thought of the chaos when the guests would arrive to an empty table. A small smile touched my lips as I imagined it, not out of cruelty but out of justice, because sometimes silence is the sharpest reply. When they thought I was seasoning the chicken, I was actually packing my passport. The night before I left, the house was heavy with silence. But it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence that comes after a long day. It was the thick, suffocating kind that presses against your chest. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing in circles. My suitcase stood in the corner, half hidden behind the curtain, ready but waiting like a secret ally. Every creak in the house made my heart pound. I was terrified someone might notice something different in my behavior, that my daughter-in-law might suddenly appear in the hallway and ask what I was doing awake. But she didn't. The house slept soundly, while I wrestled with the weight of my decision. Fear pressed against me. What if my son called me ungrateful? What if the family turned against me when they realized I had walked away? What if I was left all alone, with no place to belong? These thoughts swirled in my head like a storm, but with them came another voice, quieter, yet stronger. The voice of the woman I used to be before life taught me to shrink. She reminded me of the years I had lived without respect, of the insults disguised as jokes, the orders given without a shred of gratitude, the way I had been made invisible in my own home. That voice told me that leaving was not betrayal. It was survival. I sat up on the bed and pressed my palms together. For a moment, guilt tightened in my chest. Guilt for my son, the little boy I had once held, who now stood beside a woman that belittled me. Guilt for walking away without a word. But guilt can only hold you if you still owe something. And in that moment, I realized I had already paid in full. Through years of sacrifice, years of silence, years of bending until I almost broke. The hours dragged slowly. Every tick of the clock was a reminder that time was carrying me closer to my escape. I rose quietly, tiptoeing through the hallway, careful not to wake anyone. My daughter-in-law's door was closed, and I imagined her sleeping soundly, secure in the belief that I would be downstairs in just a few hours, chopping onions and marinating meat for her grand performance. If only she knew. At exactly 4 in the morning, I slipped on my shoes and wrapped my scarf tightly around my shoulders. My suitcase handle was cold in my hand, the wheels muffled against the carpet as I pulled it behind me. I opened the front door slowly, holding my breath so the hinges wouldn't squeak. The night air rushed in sharp, cool, and liberating. For the first time in years, I inhaled without feeling trapped. At the end of the street, a pair of headlights glowed faintly in the darkness. My taxi had arrived right on time. The driver stepped out, opened the trunk, and without a word, helped me place the suitcase inside. I slid into the back seat, my heart still pounding like a drum, my hands clenched tightly together. As the car pulled away, I turned my head toward the house one last time. It stood there, still and dark, holding memories of both love and sorrow. I whispered a silent goodbye, not because I would miss it, but because it was no longer mine. The streets were empty at that hour, the city asleep. Streetlights blurred as we drove, and with every mile that passed, the knot in my chest began to loosen. I leaned back against the seat, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to close my eyes. But instead of rest, what came were memories. Memories I had buried too deep for too long. I saw myself standing at that very stove years ago, stirring pots until my arms ached, smiling as I watched my family enjoy the meals I had prepared. I remembered birthdays where I went without new clothes so that I could buy the cake my children wanted. I remembered the late nights sitting up with my son when he was sick, wiping his forehead, praying feverishly for his health. I gave all of myself, my energy, my love, my time, because that is what mothers do. And then, just as quickly, another wave of memories followed. My daughter-in-law's sharp comments at dinner, mocking my cooking. The way she whispered to my son when she thought I couldn't hear, planting seeds of disdain against me. The countless times my son chose her side over mine, his silence louder than her insults. I remembered the way she handed me the guest list as though I were a servant, and the way he reinforced her command with his cold eyes. Those moments cut deeper than any wound. The driver cleared his throat softly, and I opened my eyes to see the airport lights glowing ahead. My chest tightened again, this time not from fear, but from anticipation. The reality of what I was doing settled in. Freedom was no longer an idea. It was a runway before me, waiting to carry me somewhere new. As the cab pulled up to the drop-off point, I stepped out and stood beneath the towering glass of the airport entrance. My suitcase rolled beside me, each turn of its wheels echoing like a drumbeat of liberation. The automatic doors opened, welcoming me into a space that felt vast, bright, and indifferent. No one here knew me as the woman forced into silence. No one here saw me as the mother who had become invisible. Here, I was just a traveler. And that anonymity felt like power. I clutched my passport tightly as I approached the counter, my hands trembling not from fear this time, but from the enormity of the moment. Every stamp, every boarding pass, every step closer to that plane was a piece of my chains falling away. And as I walked toward security, I felt the first real smile stretch across my face. A smile not for anyone else, not to hide pain or pretend at peace, but for me. By the time they woke up, I was already gone. I could see it all in my mind even though I was miles away. The clock at home must have struck 6. That was the hour I was expected to have the stove hot, the counters lined with bowls, the pans already singing with oil. I imagined my daughter-in-law sweeping into the kitchen, her voice sharp and commanding, expecting the smell of garlic and onions already in the air. Instead, she would have been met with silence. Nothing on the counters, no pots bubbling, no mother standing obediently with apron tied. I could picture her confusion turning quickly into irritation. She would call out my name once, twice, her voice rising with each unanswered shout. My son, no doubt, would step into the hallway, rubbing his eyes, frowning, already irritated before he even knew what was wrong. "Where's Mom?" he would ask, expecting me to appear from the pantry or the laundry room like I always did. But the house would give him nothing back. By then the first guests must have started to arrive. Cars pulling into the driveway, voices floating through the front door, laughter spilling into the living room. They came expecting a feast, a warm welcome, a table set in abundance. Instead, they were greeted by confusion. My daughter-in-law with her forced smile, scrambling to cover the unease, while my son paced between the kitchen and the front porch. Relatives taking off their coats, asking about the food, glancing around as the smell of roasting meat failed to reach them. I imagined the whispers beginning, the sideways glances. Hungry children tugging at their parents' sleeves, asking when they could eat. Guests clearing their throats, awkward smiles hiding growing irritation. My daughter-in-law barking orders, sending my son from one empty cabinet to another, demanding he find ingredients, pots, anything, though she knew nothing had been touched. She would be frantic, but too proud to admit what had happened. And my son, oh, I could see him pacing, his phone already in his hand, his face tightening with each unanswered call. Meanwhile, where was I? Not trapped in that chaos. Not bending under their voices. I was at the airport lounge, sitting in a quiet corner with a cup of hot coffee warming my palms. The world bustled gently around me, travelers dragging luggage, boarding calls echoing over the speakers, the soft clink of cups and plates from the cafe nearby. My phone buzzed again and again, but I let it sit face down on the table. For the first time in years, I was not at their mercy. I was not the one answering, scrambling, apologizing. The screen lit up with missed calls, first from my son, then from my daughter-in-law, then from numbers of guests I hadn't spoken to in months. The messages piled one after another. Where are you? What's happening? Did you forget? Mom, answer me. Each one more frantic than the last. But I did not move. I did not reply. I sipped my coffee slowly, tasting a freedom sweeter than anything they could imagine. For years my silence had been my weakness. Now it was my weapon. Every call ignored, every text left unread, was another stroke of my revenge. I pictured their faces as realization began to set in, that I had left, that I had chosen myself over them, that for once they could not control me. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, there was a swell of emotion rising in me. Not guilt this time, not shame, but strength. I felt myself sitting taller, my chest no longer weighed down. The woman they thought they had broken, the mother they believed they could use without end, was gone. In her place stood someone new. Someone who remembered her own worth. I watched the planes taxi outside the window, their wings cutting across the pale morning sky. My flight would be called soon. My phone buzzed again, vibrating across the table with another angry demand. I smiled, not with bitterness, but with quiet triumph. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to argue, I didn't need to explain. My absence spoke louder than any words I could ever say. By the time their guests began to realize there would be no meal, no hostess, no perfectly orchestrated event, I was already miles away in spirit, if not yet in distance. For years, I had given them everything. And now, by giving them nothing, I finally gave myself everything. That was the first taste of silent revenge, and it was enough to remind me that I was stronger than they had ever believed. I later learned what unfolded after I left, though I hardly needed anyone to tell me. I could picture it clearly. My daughter-in-law, frantic and red-faced, scrambling as the guests began to notice that nothing had been prepared. She barked orders, demanded someone run to the store, insisted that everything was under control. But the truth was, she had built her reputation on the illusion of control, and in that moment the mask fell. Instead of the neatly set table she had promised, she had nothing. The kitchen stood empty, the pots cold. My son tried to cover her embarrassment, but the damage had already been done. I imagined the relatives exchanging looks, whispering behind their hands. Some of them must have thought it odd that in a house where I had always been the one working quietly in the background, suddenly there was no meal, no preparation, nothing but chaos. As hunger set in and the morning dragged on, desperation must have followed. I pictured them scrolling frantically on their phones, calling local restaurants, begging for large orders of takeout, pizza boxes and paper bags arriving in place of the warm homemade dishes they had expected. Guests shifting uncomfortably, forced to eat off disposable plates, their faces betraying polite smiles that hid disappointment. Children whining, older relatives shaking their heads, murmuring to each other that things weren't like they used to be. And in that space, my daughter-in-law's reputation cracked. The woman who loved to boast about how well she managed her home, about how much better she could host than anyone else, was exposed. Among her own relatives, whispers spread. She couldn't even manage her own household. That humiliation was not mine to carry, it belonged solely to her. My son did not escape untouched either. For years, he had chosen her pride over my dignity. He had stood silent when she mocked me, sided with her when she diminished me, and reinforced her commands when she treated me like a servant. Now he stood in front of his family, unable to explain why his mother, the very foundation of the home, had vanished. The shame settled on his shoulders as heavily as it did on hers. I did not need to be there to defend myself. I did not need to raise my voice or argue my worth. My absence spoke louder than any words ever could. In a single morning, without a single confrontation, I made clear the truth they had chosen to ignore. I was not invisible and I would not be used. As I sat in the quiet of the airport, watching planes rise into the sky, I thought back on all the years I had given, the sacrifices that had gone unnoticed, the countless meals cooked, the nights I stayed awake tending to fevers, the holidays spent ensuring everyone else was cared for while I went without. I had poured myself into my family until there was nothing left for me. Those memories came in flashes, me standing in the kitchen with tired hands, smiling as my son licked cake batter from the spoon, me tucking him into bed, whispering prayers over his small frame, never doubting for a second that he would grow into a man who valued me, me working late into the night to patch clothes, stretch meals, and keep the house running even when money was scarce. And then the contrast, his silence when his wife mocked me, his cold agreement when she handed me lists like I was hired help, his eyes once filled with trust and love, now clouded with distance as though I were nothing more than an obligation. That single act of leaving, of walking away without a word, restored what years of sacrifice had taken from me. It reminded me that dignity is not given, it is claimed. And though I could not change the past, I could reclaim myself in the present. As I lifted my coffee cup to my lips and took another slow sip, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. True peace. It wasn't loud, it wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, steady, and unshakable. And I knew then that this was only the beginning. As I sat there waiting for my boarding call, I thought about what had just unfolded, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. For so long, I believed that love meant giving endlessly, that being a mother meant emptying myself so that others could be full. But the truth I finally understood was this. Love without respect is not love, it is servitude. And I had served long enough. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer. Sometimes walking away is stronger than staying to prove a point. My absence that morning shouted what my words never could, that I was not invisible, that I was not their servant, that my worth could not be measured by how quickly I set a table or how many mouths I fed. I don't know if my son will ever forgive me. Perhaps he will carry anger for years. Perhaps he will never understand why I chose that day, that moment, to finally stand. But I do know this. He will never again forget who I am. He will never again look at me and see someone who could be commanded without consequence. In that silence, in that empty kitchen, he learned that even a mother has her limits. And maybe one day he will see the truth, that I left not to destroy him, but to save myself. That a woman who has given everything deserves, at the very least, to be seen. If you made it this far, don't leave without giving this video a like. Subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I truly want to know how far this story has reached. When I look back now, I see more than betrayal, more than heartbreak, more than humiliation. I see a turning point. They thought I would be in the kitchen, apron tied, bending under their demands. Instead, I was in control for the first time in years.